For nearly 15 years, my 1.2-acre slice of land had been my personal sanctuary. Tucked just outside the manicured perfection of the gated community, it was a patch of quiet woodland with a small cabin I had built myself, a garden that flourished. Every spring, and a small creek that sang me to sleep at night, I kept to myself. I didn't attend the homeowners association meetings, didn't meddle in their landscaping disputes, and didn't care if their hedges were trimmed to regulation height. My property wasn't even part of their jurisdiction, or so I thought. That was why, when a letter arrived in my mailbox declaring that per the recent vote, Parcel 14B will be incorporated into the community, I nearly tossed it in the trash. It sounded like bureaucratic nonsense. But the next line caught my eye. The parcel will be transferred for development purposes, effective immediately. My parcel, my land. At first I assumed it was a mistake, called the HOA office, ready to sort it out with a polite conversation. The receptionist, with the bored tone of someone who had explained this too many times, simply said, "The board voted unanimously, and the sale has already gone through." I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. The HOA president himself called me later that day not to apologize, but to assure me that the development company would take great care of the property. Once they cleared it for a new clubhouse and pool, he said it like I should be grateful. My jaw clenched as he went on about community enrichment and shared spaces, as though the fact that I had paid taxes, maintained my land, and built my life there meant nothing. When I asked how they could possibly sell land, they didn't. He dismissed it with a casual, "It's all in the governing documents." That night, I couldn't sleep. I dug through my file cabinet, pulling out my original deed, my property tax records, and the surveyor's map. It had everything clearly. Proved I owned that land outright. The more I read, the more obvious it became that the HOA had no legitimate claim. But the next morning, when I went to the county clerk's office to confirm, I found that a corrective deed had been filed just 2 weeks earlier. It claimed that my parcel was erroneously omitted from the HOA's original subdivision plat decades ago. The kicker: the corrective deed had been signed not by me, the actual owner, but by the HOA president, acting on behalf of the community. The signature had been notarized by someone with the same last name as one of the board members. I felt my blood boil, but I also knew I had to think clearly. This wasn't a random mistake. This was a coordinated land grab, executed under the pretense of bureaucratic housekeeping. I asked for copies of every document filed in the past 6 months that mentioned my parcel. The stack the clerk handed me was thick enough to make my arm ache. As I sifted through the paperwork at a corner table, a pattern emerged: sloppy legal language, conflicting dates, signatures that didn't match. They had steamrolled the process, banking on the assumption that I wouldn't notice until it was too late. By the end of that week, the developers' trucks had already started parking along the road near my property. I watched from my porch as men in safety vests measured the land and stuck fluorescent flags in the soil. One of them had the nerve to wave at me like we were neighbors. In that moment, I made a quiet decision. If the HOA wanted to play this as a legal game, I would play too, but I would make sure I played it better. They thought they had taken something from me. They had no idea what I was about to take from them. I spent the next month buried in paperwork. Every evening after work, I sat at my kitchen table with a pot of coffee and a growing stack of county records, HOA filings, and property plats spread out like a general's war maps. The deeper I dug, the more I realized their arrogance had left them sloppy. Somewhere between their fake corrective deed and their push to flip my parcel to the developer, they'd overlooked a strange detail buried in an old yellowed file: an easement. Specifically, an easement granting me, and whoever owned my land, perpetual and exclusive maintenance rights over a large swath of the community waterfront for private recreational use. At first, I assumed it was a mistake, but the more I read, the clearer it became. Decades ago, the land where the HOA's prized $10 million row of lakefront mansions now sat had once been part of a single, massive property. The original owner had sold off sections over time, but had written in easements to protect certain rights. That easement had passed quietly with my parcel, and no one had ever formally removed it, which meant, legally speaking, I didn't just have a right to access those properties. I had a controlling interest in the very land they were built on. The HOA had tried to snatch my 1.2 acres, but in doing so, they'd awakened a sleeping legal giant they hadn't even known existed. I hired a real estate attorney, one of those calm, clinical types who never raised his voice but could dismantle. In opponent's case, like a surgeon with a scalpel, he filed the necessary paperwork with the county to correct the title records. His time in my favor, attaching the original easement language and decades of chain of title proof. The HOA's president called me in a rage when he caught wind of it, barking about fraud and community assets, but I just told him to have his lawyer call mine. Within 2 weeks, my name was officially tied to the land beneath there. Most expensive homes. The best part? Everything I did was entirely above board. Once the records were corrected, I was within my rights to sell the properties outright, and that's exactly what I did. I contacted a reputable brokerage, kept my explanations vague, and began listing them one by one. The buyers didn't care about the HOA's internal politics. They saw luxury lakefront property at market price and snapped them up quickly. The sales went through cleanly because the titles were now crystal clear, and all in my name the day the first sale closed. I drove past the HOA office. The board members were gathered in the parking lot, gesturing wildly, their faces red with panic. A week later, I heard they'd called an emergency meeting to address an unexpected property ownership crisis. Their crisis was my victory. By the time the dust settled, I had legally sold off millions of dollars worth of their crown jewel assets, leaving the association gutted and its president facing an internal mutiny. They tried to drag me into court, of course. They accused me of everything from fraud to emotional vandalism, a term their lawyer actually used with a straight face. But the judge took one look at my documentation, the unbroken paper trail, and the fact that I had followed every procedural rule to the letter, and dismissed their case without hesitation. The HOA walked out of the courtroom pale and silent. I walked out with the smug satisfaction of knowing I'd just taught them the most expensive civics lesson of their lives. In the end, I sold my original 1.2 acres as well, not because I had to, but because I could now afford 10 times the land, far away from any HOA's reach. I bought a sprawling property with hills, woods, and a private lake, where no one could dictate what color my fence should be, or whether my lawn met community standards. The HOA thought they could take from me with impunity. Took far more from them, and I did it all by playing the game they thought they'd mastered.